Hello and welcome to the big picture. With a major cabinet reshuffle exercise behind him, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh wants his government now to focus on governance and particularly on infrastructure. In the last 8 years of the two UPA governments, some major initiatives on creating infrastructure has been taken, including Bharat Nirman, JNNURM, modern airports, ports, power projects, among others. But much still needs to be done. Meanwhile, Prime Minister himself has acknowledged that the country as well as the world is going through difficult economic conditions. However, critics of the government point out that in the process of developing the infrastructure, there are some serious concerns about some of the methods employed in creating them. While public-private partnership is seen as an inevitable model to create the needed infrastructure, concerns have been expressed about the regulatory systems to supervise these projects. During the 12th five-year plan, it is estimated that rupees 45 lakh crore is needed for infrastructure development, out of which 50% is anticipated to come from private sector. There are issues of inclusive development too, which often these PPP models are seen as coming in the way. Where and how these investments will come is also another issue. We will discuss all this while asking the question, what are the roadblocks in the infrastructure development and whether there are any lessons to be learned from the experiences in the last several years. To discuss this, I have with me M.Ramachandran, former Secretary Urban Development, Government of India, and also advisor to the UP government. R.V.Kanoria, President of FICCI, will be joining us soon. And Dr. Praveen, Associate Professor at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning, JNU, and Paranjoy, Guha, Thakurta, Senior Journalist and Economic Analyst. Welcome to all of you. Let me first go to Mr. Ramachandran. Mr. Ramachandran, you have been a hands-on man when it comes to a lot of infrastructure. You've seen how it has been progressing in this country for the last several, maybe decades also. In the last 8 years, what has been your experience? You were Secretary Urban Development. You have been in charge of several of these projects, JNNURM and all that. Do you think the infrastructure projects, the way it has been handled in this country in the last decade or so, has gone on the right track?
There is scope for a whole lot of improvement. One is the decision-making process itself. Even today, what we hear is lots of infrastructure projects are held up for want of either clearances or land-related issues. I suppose if the matter regarding land acquisition or procuring land becomes clear, that will make life easier as far as infrastructure projects are concerned. The other issue is about finances becoming available for this huge sector. As you mentioned, during the forthcoming plan, 50% has to come from the private sector. So it's a question of how to have the enabling environment where this 50% would become available from the private sector. They would go by the track record. As I said, decision making, what is the priority consideration available for taking infrastructure projects forward. So I think in that there is some big decision making required as far as how to handle these infrastructure projects, especially in terms of land and the clearances required. And that would be a critical factor to bring in this 50% investment. Since you refer to the urban part also, I believe as far as India is concerned, there has to be much more focus on our urban areas, which is a major contributor to tax revenue, to GDP, to employment generation. We haven't devoted that much attention. I hope by the time the plan gets finalized and the expected next phase of the urban renewal mission comes about, there will be substantial emphasis on what needs to be done in our urban areas.
Right.
That becomes relevant because a whole lot of this investment which we are expecting and the activity which we are expecting as far as infrastructural improvement is concerned, all that gets linked with improvements in the urban areas. So that also becomes a critical area. How we guide that process, how governance improves in the urban areas, how service delivery improves. and how we bring in more resources for having the basic infrastructure in the urban areas. Everyone knows, even access to water, we are not at a 100% level. Sanitation, traffic congestion, higher reliance on personalized modes of transport, which is causing more pollution and more congestion and more problems, the time wasted. So there are a whole lot of aspects, even within the urban agenda, which would need to be addressed. I hope it will get a fillip if the second phase of the urban mission is announced, where cities will have to be somewhat competitive in the sense that they will have to also chip in and register their presence as far as these much desired improvements are concerned. I can give an example of service level benchmarks. I mean, in a city, what the citizen ultimately looks forward to is the basics being available in an assured and definite standard.
Yeah, that's right. Praveen, the same question which I asked.
Right.
Yes.
I think in terms of problem, there is a whole range of problems, from the conception itself of what our urban spaces should be, how should we visualize urban infrastructure, etc. The kind of resources which are required.
And the rural infrastructure also.
Absolutely. I'm saying, infrastructure in general, but since the sort of, I mean, that itself has been a huge issue of debate and discussion, etc. And I don't think we have really moved forward. If anything, we probably have moved backwards in the last, I would say, couple of decades, with a limited focus on a few mega things, whereas a number of very critical issues, sanitation was mentioned, drinking water was mentioned, etc. These remain extremely neglected areas. And many of these things, in terms of institutional mechanisms, for instance, there's a whole lot which gets decided in Delhi. Why? What is the reason for the kind of centralized decision making when a great deal of it needs to be decentralized? Number 3, adequate resources. Now, that has been possibly the Achilles heel.
Absolutely.
Right? If you look at last, again, couple of decades and so on, the accent has been more and more on something called public-private
PPP,
partnership.
yes.
And we know that there are, of course, very strong advocates, but on the other hand, there's been huge criticism of it. Many who have argued that it is basically private making opportunities
at the cost of public.
At the cost of, profit making opportunity for the private sector, etc. So I think there are huge issues there which need to be addressed. There was a lot of expectation during the 11th five-year plan, was not fulfilled. We know that it was, in fact, the sort of numbers that you have, the achievement was well below what was expected and so on. And hence one needs to sort of think about whether that mechanism is something which is working well. And if you think that is broadly the right mechanism to have in place, what should be the nitty-gritty? How do you take care of some of the gaps, etc.? I mean, I think those would be issues.
We will discuss this. Both Mr. Ramachandran and Paranjoy will be, we need to talk about this also. But let me get back to Mr. Kanoria. Mr. Kanoria, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Kanoria.
I can hear you.
Yeah, okay. The Prime Minister's focus now on infrastructure. My question is, what do you think needs to be focused in the infrastructure? What are the key areas where it needs to be focused? And what are the experiences? What are the lessons learned from the experiences in the past, say, a decade or so? And how does the industry look at it?
I think if you look at infrastructure, we need to address it, one, from the policy perspective, which means create the right policy so that the allocation of natural resources or fuel linkages for the power sector can be made. Secondly, we have to make land acquisition easily possible for infrastructure projects, both for power projects which require consolidated tracts of land as well as for road projects which require linear acquisition of land.
Yes.
And I think third, we have to address the issue of financing, because if we require large amounts of finance, we need to ensure that there is a right match between the long-term availability of finance versus the long-term financing needs, which means reforms in the pension and insurance sectors, so that long-term cheap funds can become available for infrastructure.
Right.
So I think infrastructure has to be addressed looking at the lessons which we have learned from in the past, particularly with regard to transparency and allocation of these resources which are required for infrastructure. And in my opinion, we have to address power, which is the number one problem, and connectivity in the form of roads. And if I may be allowed to add, I think we have to start looking at railways beyond a common man's means of transport to railways actually as a means of mass transport both for goods as well as for people.
Okay, Paranjoy, coming to you. No, we now have some idea of what the industry wants. I have two questions. One is the PPP thing which Praveen was talking about, and also the regulatory systems which need to be put into place in these kind of PPP models, because that is where the problems lie.
Okay. Let me make three sets of observations. The first is regarding the public-private partnership.
Right.
I think what Dr. Praveen Jha just now said is very, very important. You know, one of the big flaws in the way in which public-private partnerships have been structured is that all the risks and the liabilities tend to be with the public sector, and all the profit-making opportunities are with the private sector. Now, this tends to be heavily loaded, and in my opinion, this is not the best way to do it. And as the point that Mr. Kanoria made, we need complete transparency in the way these public-private partnerships work. Because unless you do that, you're going to get more and more charges of crony capitalism of the kind that we have seen. I think one point which both Mr. Kanoria and Mr. Ramachandran earlier flagged is very, very important, the issue of land acquisition.
Right.
And particularly, as Mr. Kanoria pointed out, for the major power projects.
And clearances.
Yes.
I suppose when he's talked of clearances, he was talking of environmental clearances also.
No, it's more than that. It's not just environmental clearance. And when you talk about power projects, when you talk about coal projects, when you talk about highway projects, the issue is of acquisition of land.
Right.
And this is the area where when you are acquiring fertile farmland for non-agricultural purposes.
Right.
Now, we've seen already a huge kind of debate that's going on within the government, within the empowered group of ministers, within the cabinet. We have people like Mr. Sharad Pawar, Mr. Kamal Nath speaking in one voice, Mr. Jairam Ramesh, Ms. Jayanti Natarajan speaking in another voice.
Right.
The whole issue is, Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, we understand, has argued that you must have consent of 80% of the landholders before you acquire land. Now, this is a substantial rise from the earlier proposal that was made, which was about roughly 66% or two-thirds.
Yes.
Now, this would make it that much more challenging to acquire contiguous and large tracts of land, especially when this includes fertile farmland.
Right.
We've seen the problems that West Bengal has. Yes. So this, in my opinion, is a very, very important challenge. Unless you change that land acquisition law, unless you have to go back. You can't continue in that 1890 British law. That's archaic. You have to change the law. But the political consensus on the new law is the big issue. Okay. Now the third point that you made, and which I think is a very, very important point, is this whole regulatory mechanism, or rather the absence of regulatory mechanism. I mean, take this big controversy that we are today having about Krishna Godavari gas and the way it was allegedly one company, Reliance Industries, was allegedly favored because you had a production sharing contract which was heavily weighted in favor and against the interests of the government. Now, we have all kinds of views on it. But one thing I can tell you here, which is coming through loud and clear, you have a Petroleum and Natural Gas Regulatory Board, which is completely toothless. It's not empowered. It should have been an ideal body, if it was adequately empowered, to look into such disputes.
Absolutely.
The whole issue of production sharing, the whole issue of capital expenditure, all these should have been addressed by technical bodies. Take the case of the Director General of Hydrocarbon, the DGH. You had earlier a DGH who is currently facing a CBI case.
Absolutely.
I'm talking about Mr. Sibal,
right,
for allegedly favoring a couple of firms. Now you have another DGH. Now the whole issue is we have not been able to put in place regulatory mechanisms which are independent, which are operating in a fair and a transparent manner. The regulators typically tend to be retired bureaucrats.
Right.
And these are, so the regulatory authority becomes an extension of the bureaucracy, because some bureaucrats who are perceived to be pliant are given that job.
Yeah.
So these, in my opinion, are very, very critical if we want the infrastructure in this country to develop and grow in a
Mr. Ramachandran, you have personally experienced all these things. Two issues. One is the PPP model, which if I am correct, you are one of the advocates of that PPP model. You have worked that PPP model yourself. And the other issue is of regulatory systems, which Paranjoy was talking about.
As far as the PPPs are concerned, I don't think we have any other option, because we have followed that path of public sector alone doing most of this work. Then we reached a stage where we need faster infrastructure growth and we have to find the resources. So it's a question of working out the PPPs. We have enough experience now. It's a question of looking at that and what modifications need to be brought about. And I think it's possible. And today people have started talking about one more P to be added, people also to be added in that wherever it is relevant. It becomes the 4 Ps. In certain sectors, it has slowly started getting stabilized. I think roads and power, which started off with the PPPs, there is tremendous amount of experience available. When we go to a sector like urban or so, it cannot be one centralized experience. Each state will have to clearly state what it wants in the form of PPP and what the ground rules would be. The required documentation has to be developed. There are many sectors where even if there has to be a PPP, there is no clarity as to what is the policy and what is the documentation one has to follow. There could be situations where a local body takes a decision about a PPP. If the state government does not like that, or if one question has not been addressed to the state government, the entire PPP could get questioned. So we have to remove that atmosphere of distrust, and we have to have a common understanding that the very statement that 50% of the investment has to come from private sector means there is a clearly stated position that we have to find that type of resources. So we have to find how that resources can come about, what is the best possible method. I don't think a perfect method would become available. So we have to base it on our
trial
experience.
and error. You're talking of a trial and error method which we can
And improvements which can be brought about based on experience. On the second point about regulators, there are some sectors where there are regulators. Today, on the one hand, we talk about regulating the regulators. On the other hand, we have regulators who are not able to perform and deliver.
He's talking of the petroleum.
Exactly.
Yes.
So we have to look at that. If there is a regulator, whether it is retired, serving, or whatever it is, that regulator has to be able to perform the role of an umpire if that is required, and that regulator
An honest umpire.
should be strengthened to that extent. There are sectors where there are no regulators available. Once again, I would go to the urban sector.
Urban sector, yes.
That does not, you see, such a
All
scenario,
these land issues, controversies on land, scams are all because there is no regulator on the issue of land.
partly one could say that, and also it depends on the structuring. If it's a PPP contract, how it has been structured.
Right.
But if there is a mechanism available, if X or Y has a grievance, there is a forum one can go to, and that forum is considered independent, and that forum facilitates the process of taking infrastructure forward rather than becoming hindrance. One has to look at it from that point of view.
In fact, we have had some experience with TRI also, how the Telecom Regulatory Authority has been functioning. About that also there has been several. Anyway, we'll continue this discussion. We need to go into a short break now. Please keep watching. We'll come back very soon and continue this very interesting discussion. Welcome back. We are discussing the infrastructure growth in this country, which the Prime Minister is talking about focusing during the next few months or several months that this government is in existence, and asking the question, what are the roadblocks for this infrastructure growth? Dr. Praveen, one of the things is inclusive. How to make this infrastructure growth inclusive? For instance, one of the instances we talk about, we are talking of this, highways being built, right, roads being built with all this, and charging of the user fees, and that is where we see the problems coming up. The local people are not having problems saying that we don't want to pay. How does this problem can be overcome?
Of course, in terms of inclusive growth, there are many problems, and maybe some are much deeper than the question of user charges, for instance. Let's say in Delhi, for instance, you sort of want to be, let's say, build some flyovers, some swanky malls, etc. Sort of kind of projects which probably go very well with a certain vision
development.
Now, and in the process, there are large segments of populations who are either shunted out of the city, thrown out, and Now, those are issues which possibly are far more fundamental in some sense in terms of thinking of inclusive growth.
Yes.
What kind of projects do we take for inclusive growth-oriented infrastructure. And I think these are some of the questions where possibly things have got skewed in the other side, to the other side.
Right.
So we keep talking of inclusive growth, but if anything, it's more and more exclusive. So that is a problem which I don't think is getting sorted out at all. And if you ask me what is one big problem with India's infrastructure
story,
planning, etc. story, I think it's a question of resources. And I do not think that by relying largely on the private sector, this can be taken care of.
Yes,
In a desirable
Paranjoy.
manner.
I think the huge debate that is going on in this country, and I think it's
Mr. Ramachandran says there is no option but to go in for public-private partnerships.
All right. Let me, for the time being, not disagree with him. I could disagree with him on some issues, because I could argue that the role of the public sector is very important in certain sectors where the private sector really can't play.
They don't invest also.
Okay, so one issue which we've discussed is the issue of having an independent regulatory authority, which is adequately empowered and which is truly independent, and if necessary has punitive powers
Right.
to enforce contracts and punish people. I want to take off on a point which was made earlier, this whole issue of land acquisition, and you look at mining. Just look at mining in this country. We have a situation where you juxtapose the forest map of this country with the minerals map, and on top of that map, juxtapose the population of scheduled tribes. And what the Home Ministry's figures of left-wing extremism. And you'll find that these maps are all overlapping
matching.
and virtually, one overlaps with the other.
Right.
So coal gate we've seen, those allocation of coal blocks are done in a fair, transparent manner, and that you don't lead to the forms of cronyism that we've seen, that all these coal blocks were now, they're connected with influential people, ministers, including one minister who's who's been sort of done, who's been removed in the recent cabinet reshuffle. You see the worst forms of crony capitalism.
Yes.
Their relatives, friends, all getting these coal blocks.
Mr. Ramachandran, crony capitalism becomes, when you talk of PPPs, crony capitalism is associated with it.
See, it depends on how you want to move forward. As I said, there is not much of an option left if we remain to be dependent only on the public sector. The private sector initiative has come.
Foreign investments, people, there are a lot of government and others who support this. They say that foreign investments are very much necessary for these kind of infrastructure projects. Are we getting any foreign investments for infrastructure projects? They're all coming into the service sector, where they can make a quick buck and move out.
That's dependent on the investor confidence which we have, and it keeps varying these days. We know that also. There could be different channels of doing it. Whereas external assistance is concerned through multilateral organizations, we have more or less reached a limit. So we have to look at other means.
Other means private investments.
We'll have to look for other, similar sources. That's what we'll have to be dependent on. So what is the option left? Either we decide to scale down the rate of growth which we should have, and in infrastructure also we decide not to go in for this huge mandate or huge agenda. If there is a 50% target kept, I suppose that has been done after enough deliberations. Now, as I said, when we look at PPPs, it's a question of properly guiding it, taking it forward, and that's where I would say PPP policies and policies relating to infrastructure facilitation have to be much more clearer, transparent, more accessible to a larger number of people so that it's well known rather than it is leading to situations like the one which you mentioned, or it leads to certain doubts at certain stage. So there is tremendous amount of efforts required as far as laying down these basics are concerned. And that's where I think the ministry should play a much more active and key role and be forthcoming as far as these basics are concerned.
No, but very quickly, I want your own experiences as Urban Development Secretary when you had to, lay down what you're talking of. The ministries have to be very active. When you tried to be active, what were the roadblocks?
That's a different story because today governance itself is a big issue. So I don't want to go into discussion of governance as such.
Yes.
There has to be a certain level of confidence as far as performance is concerned.
Right.
And with performance, there could be some slips here and there, which are deliberate, one has to take note of, which are not deliberate, but which is in the larger interest of this scheme of things.
Okay.
I think one has to be able to go along with that. And if that type of confidence is not there, one will only try to shift blame and try to find loopholes in the system and
Okay,
policies.
Paranjoy, quickly,
I want to make a
very
point.
quickly.
I make a point on this issue of using foreign, getting foreign funds for infrastructure development. Foreign fund, which is not, World Bank, the World
Private
Bank.
investors.
Yes. There was a debate in this country about whether we should utilize our reserves, the reserves of foreign currency, which are with the Reserve Bank of India. People like Mr. Monteek Singh Ahluwalia, Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, he argued, should we not use? We are sitting on, billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of, foreign currency. But there was a big problem. One is, this money, not all of it is, this money, some of it is in the form of loans.
Right.
This money has come,
Which
which has to be
quickly,
repaid.
Paranjoy,
But secondly, how do you ensure that, why should a foreign entity be wanting to invest in Indian roads or an Indian power plant unless you structure systems for them where it is profitable to them?
Okay.
We've seen the problems we had with Enron.
Absolutely. Enron is a great example. Praveen, last words to you. What do you expect, what is your basic expectation when it comes to these kind of infrastructure projects from the government?
You see, as I said earlier, unless there is a substantial mobilization of resources and efforts from the government,
Right.
I don't think it's happening.
He spoke about the RBI, or
Yeah.
the reserves which we have being used. I don't know whether that's...
I don't think they would want to touch that precisely because of, a controversial attitude within the government towards that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, we are completely run out of time, but that was an interesting discussion. Infrastructure, nobody disagrees. Infrastructure is the most important issue for this country, but how to go about it continues to be an issue of debate, and such debates need to continue so that we can do things in the right manner so that the people are not affected. Thank you very much. Thanks to all my guests, Mr. R.V.Kanoria, Paranjoy Guha Thakurta, Mr. Ramachandran and Dr. Praveen. Please keep watching. We'll come back with another issue on the big picture, same time on Monday.